Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday the 27th of April, and you are watching episode 46 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing the insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, the inputs and expertise of the IPCC Working Group 2, Climate Change, the Consequences, is my guest, Professor Brenden Mackey. Professor Mackey is the Director of the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University, Queensland. He has a PhD in ecology from the Australian National University. Professor Mackey was the coordinating lead author for the IPCC assessment report from Working Group 2, Impacts, Vulnerability and Adaptation, as well as a drafting author for the summary to policy makers. He is an international recognised expert in these fields. And in addition to the IPCC, he has contributed to the programs of the World Meteorological Organisation, the Food and Agriculture Organisation, and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Professor Mackey has undertaken studies for the Queensland Government on environmental matters in northern Queensland and has served on a number of technical advisory committees. His Griffith University Beacon program is currently assisting Queensland government agencies in identifying their climate-related risks. Professor Mackey has authored some 290 academic publications in the related fields of climate change, biodiversity, land use and sustainability. Welcome, Brenden.
Good evening, Bill. Good to be here.
Pardon?
I said good to be here.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you okay. For some reason I have... There, we're back. Welcome to the night. We thank you very much for your time. Now, if you can give us a bit of a brief about yourself, your younger days and how you got into the field that you're currently in, and then how you sort of got drafted into the IPCC reports system.
Yeah, well, as you noted, a long time ago now, I did a PhD at the Australian National University. It was actually looking at, it was up in the wet tropics. I was based up at the CSIRO lab at Adaptation, and I was actually studying how the climate affects the different ecosystems and rainforests that are found in the wet tropics. And that was when I first got interested in the climate and how climate affects our natural systems, but also our human systems, such as our food production systems. After my PhD, I went and worked as a research scientist actually in Canada for the Canadian Forest Service. And again, my research there, that was, you know, when our understanding of the seriousness of the climate change problem was rising. So again, that became the focus of my work. And I moved to Queensland about 10 years ago to take up this position at Griffith University, based at their Gold Coast campus. In terms of how I got involved in the IPCC, it's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it's a process that's designed, it's been set up by governments, by the world governments, to provide them with the best scientific advice. So, and every 7 years, there's what's called a major assessment report. And how the authors are selected is that each government, in our case, Australian government, writes to every university and the CSIRO and other research organisations and say, can you nominate people who have got relevant expertise? And then the Australian government looks at those names and selects ones that they think would be suitable. And they forward them to the IPCC has a secretariat, and they take all these recommendations for experts that come from all the governments, all the world's governments, And out of that, they select people who will be authors of these reports. So there are 3 reports: Working Group 1, Working Group 2, Working Group 3. I was selected to be one of 200 authors, for about 200 authors for Working Group 2.
Now, each working group creates a summary for policymakers that is put into a final report of all three working groups. Is that right?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I've got a couple of slides I can show you which explain the process, if that would help. I'll just share my screen here.
That's up.
So I hope you can see that. So there's 3 working groups. The first one looks at the physical science basis of climate change. So how is the climate changing, and how do we know why it's changing, and how do we know what the human influence is on that? And also, based upon our scientific models, what will the future climate look like in 10 years' time or 100 years' time? The second working group looks at what science is saying about, well, what is the impact of that changing climate, the observed impact, what have we found the impact to be on our natural systems, on the Great Barrier Reef, or on our forests? What's happening to sea level rise and coastal erosion, or what's happening to Torres Strait Islands? And also the impact of a changing climate on our agriculture, on our grazing systems or cropping systems. And what's our vulnerability? So the climate's changing, it's impacting us, but how badly are we being impacted? And that's the function of kind of how vulnerable we are to those impacts. And then the working group 2 also looks at adaptation. Well, what can we do about it? The climate's changing, it's having these impacts. We're vulnerable in certain ways. How can we change what we do so that we minimize the risks or avoid the harm? The third working group looks at mitigation of climate change. And here what we mean by mitigation is Working Group 1 has established that the human influence on the climate comes from greenhouse gas emissions, from burning fossil fuels and deforestation and degradation, but mainly fossil fuels. So how can we mitigate those greenhouse gas emissions to slow down or halt the human influence climate change? Now, if you look at our report, Working Group 2, I've got some details about it here. There's actually 2 reports. You mentioned the summary for policymakers. That's the one on the left-hand side.
Yep.
It's a high-level synthesis of the full report, and it's actually it's actually written in collaboration between the science authors and the government representatives. And I'll explain why in a minute, but it's a pretty brief report. It's about 35 pages long, and it's meant to be written in language that policymakers can understand. Over on the right-hand side, we've got the full report. It's got 18 chapters. It's over 3,600 pages long. There were 270 authors from 67 countries. We assessed 34,000 scientific publications to find out what science has shown us, what has science found that impacts vulnerability and adaptation since the last report 7 years ago. And drafts of those reports are released to experts and to governments for review. So government experts and also other experts at universities can look at drafts. There were 3 drafts and provide critical feedback that we have to respond to. And then what we end up with is this report. 18 chapters on these different topics that are looking at impacts, vulnerability and adaptation. Now, not many people read the full report, right?
I wonder why.
and it's very technical. It's science-based writing. There's actually a chapter called Australasia, which is focused on Australia and New Zealand, which we can talk about tonight. It's still 102 pages long. It does have a 2-page executive summary, which, you know, which I could recommend everyone to read. Only 2 pages. Anyway, what happens after this report is written and it's gone through the peer review process and any errors have been corrected? A 2-week meeting is held between the authors, not all 270, a selection of them, and get representatives from every government. And what the authors do is we produce a 35-page summary of the 3,600 pages, and we try and write it in kind of friendlier, easier to understand language. And then the government representatives go through it line by line, and we've got to explain and justify, you know, what's the scientific basis for that statement. And if we've written something which they think, well, that sounds a bit odd, we've got to be able to show them in the big document why we said that. It's very, very tough negotiation process. They can't, the government representatives being you know, bureaucrats, etc., aren't, you know, their job is not to, if you like, criticise the full report, because that's already been reviewed. But it's how we're trying to translate that into kind of plain English, or at least maybe not plain English for the average person, but, you know, language that a bureaucrat can understand. Some people might say that's a long way from plain English. So yeah, so that's called the summary for policy makers, and it's a kind of high-level synthesis report. If you really want to see what's happening in it, what the story is for Australia or for different regions of the world, or for some of the big issues like food and fibre or what's happening in the oceans, then you got to go to the full report. So when you look down for chapter 11, which provides a comprehensive assessment for Australia and New Zealand, what did we look at? We looked at what are the observed impacts of climate change on our natural and human systems. By natural system, I just mean like an ecosystem like forest or a coral reef. And human systems, by that I mean everything we kind of are in control of or manage. Food production systems, our food and fibre production systems, our aquatic farming systems, our human settlements, our infrastructure, all of that stuff. Of course, one of the things that Working Group 1 tells us is that the climate has changed. We've had quite a significant amount of human influenced climate change since pre-industrial levels, and we've got observed impacts from that. So what have we observed? What has the science observed for Australia? And also the models are projecting how the climate is likely to change in the future, in the coming decades. And we can look at what impact could that have on our systems. And then there's this issue of vulnerability. Well, some things are more sensitive to climate than others. For example, turns out coral reefs are very sensitive to climate. But also looking at people, if you work outdoors, you're actually very sensitive to, you're very exposed to, you know, heat waves, right, if you're an outdoor worker. A lot of our vulnerability is also to do with social inequity. You know, if you're, you know, in very simple terms, if you've got a lot of money and you live in a hazardous area, you can afford to move. You know, if you live on a floodplain and you're at risk of flooding, if you've got a lot of money, you can probably afford to move to an area that's not hazardous. But so a lot of the vulnerabilities can relate just to social inequalities. We also looked at this in terms of every economic sector, agriculture, different, you know, urban, human and settlements, all of these things, and also particular communities, including remote communities, rural communities and Indigenous communities. We identified 9 key risks for Australia, which you might want to talk about. These are climate-related risks. And then we looked at, well, how well is Australia doing with adaptation? What progress have we made in recognising these climate impacts and changing what we do, adapting to them? And we can give some examples, in Queensland, actually, of very good adaptation work. And then we've got this, again, this ends up being a technical term, climate resilient development. Well, that just means we want the economy to grow and we want there to be more jobs for people and all of that. But, we've got to deal with the fact that the climate's changing. It brings all these risks that we've got to try and manage. And also we do have to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we kind of have to do everything. So that's a summary of what the 3 reports did, little bit about what was involved. And I'll just say one more thing. So this report is not the opinion of the authors. What our job was to evaluate the scientific publications that have occurred in the last 7 years since the last report and assess, well, what's new about, what's the update? We've had 34,000 scientific publications that have looked at climate change impacts, adaptation and vulnerability somewhere in the world. What are they telling us? What do we now know that we didn't know before? So that's why we call it an assessment report. We're assessing what the scientific literature, and in this case 34,000 publications, is telling us that's new or updating what we know, but compared to what we knew 7 years ago.
Just before we go on to the bit more detail about what the report's telling us, you're doing some work for the Queensland government in regards to risk assessment for the various agencies and that. And you've also done some work in North Queensland. Can you just touch on those couple of areas work-wise, what's involved there, and did you come up to North Queensland and sort of kick the dirt sort of thing?
Yeah, well, the far North Queensland work I certainly did. Was to do with a couple of state government committees that were looking at natural and cultural heritage areas on Cape York Peninsula. And so that involved quite extensive travel all around the Cape and meeting with various communities. As I said, my PhD work was done in the wet tropics. And we've also been working, we have a PhD student working with some tourist operators in far North Queensland, looking at this issue of climate change impacts in the tourist sector and what this means in terms of adaptation. In terms of the work with the Queensland government, I think it's a very interesting story. And it came about because you might have heard of Moody and Paws. They're a company that does the credit rating. A credit rating. So every state government has a credit rating, and that credit rating determines the cost at which they borrow money, the interest rate they charge when they borrow money. And a couple of years ago, Moody and Paws modified their, and it's a risk assessment. What they're doing is assessing how good or bad a risk the Queensland government is. It's a risk assessment. So every government department has to have a risk, it's called an enterprise risk management system, where they have to kind of recognise and register their risks and have a plan of how they're going to address those risks. Well, Moody and Paws said, okay, we're going to start including in our schedule of risks we consider, climate-related risks. So you're going to have to show us that you understand what your climate-related risks are and you've got a management plan for them. So that's when we were approached by the Queensland Government Department to help them develop a program that would enable the departments to respond to this. And the work we're doing there is working with these government departments to help them understand what's meant by a climate risks, what constitute a climate related risk, and then help them identify those risks and work out what they can do about it and have this incorporated in their enterprise risk management framework. So it's very interesting that it's actually the world of finance, if you like, credit ratings that has driven this development within the state government. And every state government's having to do this now. So this concept of climate risk has become mainstreamed.
Yeah, well, a lot of companies now, the United States has sort of pushed for incorporation into their reports to the Security Exchange Commission,
Right.
detailing their risk factors and that. So it's now reportable.
That's right. Yeah. And it's now, that, as you say, that listed companies have to include climate risks in their annual reports, and governments now do as well.
If we just move on to some of the more immediate observed or considered risks, I would expect that the things we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, was the 2019 25 bushfire season, and then this earlier this year, and just recently a series of heavy rainfall events in southeast Queensland and going down into New South Wales, one on top of another. And actually, I think it started off very early in the piece with heavy downfalls originally around the Bundaberg, Harvey Bay area. That was the first substantial impact for 2022. And then we had two subsequent impacts that bore down further south on Brisbane and northern New South Wales. And with the second episode, again, repeating the whole scenario of the first, but also adding a lot of drama and impact to northern New South Wales. And there was a lot of flack over the preparedness in those sort of areas, and especially in regards to the age of the levees and things like that, that they didn't stand up to the test of time.
Yeah, so that's right. So, and this is such an important topic. So we know that Australia has always had extreme weather events. We've always had droughts and floods and bushfires, tropical cyclones. So having a drought or a flood or a bushfire or a tropical cyclone is not new to Australia. So what's different now? Well, and this was a major finding of the Working Group 1 report, is that human influence climate change has, because we're used to thinking about climate change as being something, maybe something gradual. We talk about climate trends. The average temperature is rising and the average sea level is rising. And we think of that as being a, slow, continuous climatic trend, which it is. And 7 years ago, we would say, well, we don't have the science to say that those rising climate trends are directly affecting or indirectly affecting extreme weather events. The science wasn't there to show that. It was in theory, but we didn't have any data to show it was actually happening. Well, that's all changed. So the last 7 years, there's been a huge advance in what it's called attribution science. This is where we can attribute a major change in extreme events, and for big events, even the likelihood of that big event, as it's, the extent to which human influenced climate change has driven those events. So the science is very clear now that human influenced climate change has already caused, is causing, and will continue to cause an increase in the frequency and the severity and the duration of all extreme weather events. So that includes wildfire. Now, when I talk about bushfires, the scientific term is wildfire. And it's important to make a difference between what we call bushfire weather or dangerous wildfire weather and an actual bushfire or wildfire. Because in order to have a really bad bushfire, you've got to have really bad fire weather. It's got to be, you know, the preceding season had to be really dry. So all the vegetation is super dry. And then you need really high temperatures, super high temperatures, and then really strong wind. And then you need one more thing, you need an ignition. You either need nature to send down some lightning, or you need a human to light a fire under those dangerous conditions. Obviously, if the weather's not if the weather's not extreme, you don't get extreme bushfires. If the fire weather's what we call the fire weather conditions are mild, you get mild weather. Obviously, if it's raining, nothing, you can't light a fire. So what we're seeing, and this is what the working group 1 showed, we're seeing a worsening of fire weather conditions. Whether that translates into an actual fire depends upon there being ignition, obviously. But we're seeing, and this is more for Eastern Australia and Southern Australia, we're seeing, including central, I guess, and southeast Queensland and all around Eastern and Southern Australia, declining winter rainfall. And that's what happened in 2019. It was like just about the driest winter, unprecedented, really dry winter. So what that meant at the end of winter and start of spring, all the vegetation everywhere was just incredibly dry, highly flammable. And then we had these extraordinary heat waves, like in September. So you had 2 of the triggers for a major wildfire event. And both of those factors are being made worse by climate change. Climate change is making winter rainfall dry in southern and eastern Australia, including kind of central southeastern Queensland, and it's making temperatures hotter. Summer's getting longer, if you like. Fire season starting much sooner, and we're getting hotter temperatures, and that's happening everywhere. So heat waves are becoming hotter, and they're becoming more frequent, and we're getting them more often. And similarly when we think about rainfall, we either have too much rain or we have too little, and again, climate change is a big factor there. So everyone, I think, has now heard about these atmospheric phenomena, processes we call El Nino and La Nina, which are to do with how air and warm water cycles over the Pacific Ocean. And at the moment we're in a La Nina phase, which means we're getting a lot of rain. And when we're in an El Nino phase, we don't get much rain. Climate change is making that cycle more intense. So the drier part of the cycle's drier and the wetter part's wetter. And what we've seen in Australia, particularly since the 60s and 70s, is an increase in the intensity of heavy rainfall days. So heavy rainfall is getting heavier, and as a result, the magnitude of floods is getting bigger. Overall, though, rainfall, the climate change effect on rainfall is very complicated. With temperature, it's very straightforward. Everywhere is getting a lot hotter. Everywhere is getting a lot warmer, and the hotter days are getting hotter. But rainfall is very complicated. As I said, kind of eastern and southern Australia, the winters are getting drier. The summers aren't necessarily getting drier. If anything, they may go up a bit. Northern Australia, it's very complicated. I think everyone has heard that, southwest Western Australia, the rainfall's decreased probably 20% since the 70s. It's on a long downward trend. The Kimberleys, it's increased 20%. it's on an upward trend. So as you go around Australia, the climate change has different effects on rainfall. For northern Queensland, as I said, when we have droughts or rainfall events as a result of this El Nino La Nina cycle, they'll be more intense. But otherwise, the rainfall signal's not clear. There's no clear signal that the total annual rainfall is going to decline in Northern Australia, or that there'll be a particular seasonal effect. But certainly when it comes to all the extremes, same with tropical cyclones. So the evidence is not that we're not seeing more tropical cyclones. We always get a lot, but we are seeing more intense ones. So we know that in the South Pacific, they've now had 2 Category 5 tropical cyclones, whereas previously they hadn't seen that intensity. So tropical cyclones don't seem to be getting more frequent. They do seem to be getting more intense. Rainfall is more intense. Heavy rainfall is more intense. Droughts are getting more intense, and we're getting more dangerous wildfire conditions. And there's a clear signal now, scientific signal, that that's being driven by climate change.
I think the other thing is too, with rainfall, is there's added complexities when they start talking about the Pacific Deco oscillation. Then there's something out in the Indian Ocean
that's right.
Comes into it as well. So there's a number of factors, and also depends on where they are each in the cycle. Sort of makes the matter more complex to pin down. And I suppose the other thing, sometimes it's not helpful in regards to some of the forecasts early in the year. Like we get the Met Bureau saying, well, it's going to be a big year for cyclones. You know, we're expecting some 14 cyclones in the Pacific area, and maybe 3 or 4 will touch down overland in Australia on the East Coast. And then the predictions are nowhere near the thing. Do you think sometimes it's not overly helpful with people making some of these predictions and early in the piece sort of thing, and just it's probably better left to, all right, the Weather Bureau's got to provide warnings in advance, but maybe they should stay away from predicting what's going to happen over the full year or something like that?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, put it this way, the modelling is getting more and more accurate. I mean, the longer you project in the future, the more the error and the more uncertainty there is, right? So a projection about the rainfall tomorrow is going to be a lot more accurate than the one about June and the one about December, just because, you know, it's more into the future. But, you know, the understanding of these El Nino, La Nina cycles and the Indian dipole, they're the same thing, but in 2 different oceans. They've just got different names. These cycles that operate on a kind of decadal 5 to 10 year cycle. But as I said, those cycles are getting more intense because of climate change. So we know there's a clear connection now. But I think I think the Bureau of Meteorology does a pretty good job. I mean, but you know, they're not toothsayers. They can't. The models are limited. But you know, they did accurately project that this is going to be a wet year, right? And that we were going to get very intense rainfall. But you know, as we've said, rainfall isn't like temperature. Temperature is much more, it's a much better behaved climatic variable. Rainfall's very naughty, it varies too much. It's very hard to model. And
its location. The location is the problem. I mean, sometimes like who cares in Cairns? Who cares if we get 800 millimeters in April or February or whatever? It's not fairly commonplace. We expect that impact. The environment seems to handle it. However, if you suddenly go and put that 800 mils down in the southeast, it causes massive problems because the urbanisation factor, the runoff, the inability to get rid of the runoff quickly, impacts, and that's basically what we've seen in Brisbane and also in Lismore in particular. So one of the big problems is we do and always have built on floodplains, and it is a problem. And I think that the work you're doing should be encouraging governments, A, to look at the regulations in regards to where people can build, and B, if you can't really afford to move and buy them out, then get the levies in place, get the infrastructure there to provide and afford the best protection for the community and lives.
Yeah, well, this is where this, what we call adaptation comes in. And as you say, we've always had to kind of manage these extreme events because it's part of living in Queensland. But because the climate's changing, the risks are changing. So, and this is the big challenge for local governments and land use planning and spatial planning. Because if you think about what happened in Lismore, they had a 10-metre levee, right? And that's because when they built the levee, that was higher than the record flood. And then a couple of years ago, they had a 12-metre flood. And then at the end of February, they had a 14.5-metre flood. And there's a climate change signal here because, as I said, we've seen, it varies depending where you are in Australia, but it varies between a 7 to 20% increase in the intensity of heavy rainfall events. So we're actually going to get more heavy rainfall events, not less. So, there's a limit to how high you can build a levee, right? And so this is where you need to think about, well, what are the adaptation options? So if you're living on a floodplain, and the same applies actually in the coastal zone, if you're worried about sea level rise and coastal erosion, what are your kind of adaptation strategies? Well, you can defend where you are, and if you're on a floodplain, one defence is a levee. You can accommodate, you can put your house up on stilts, or you can kind of have what's called a managed retreat, where you actually relocate to a non-flood zone. Well, they've tried the first two in Lismore. They built a levee. All the houses on the floodplain were up. A lot of them were up 10 metres, 11 metres, but they still got flooded with 4 metres of water. So now they're now looking seriously at a kind of managed retreat adaptation strategy. So that's the big question now for Lismore. Should we I could show you some photos. The entire CBD of Lismore is basically shut down, right? Because every shop is either boarded up or it's emptied. And the question is, do they try and rebuild the CBD, or do they shift it out of the valley bottom? This is the adaptation challenge they now face. And
well,
the same
that
is
was
true in
basically something in the Lockheed Valley at Grantham, and that they actually eventually made the decision. We have to withdraw from here. We have to move at least to 20, 30 metres higher ground, and they actually moved the whole population and all the infrastructure. Although the thing is, Grantham and the Lockheed Valley is nowhere as big a problem as what Lismore is and its huge population.
Yeah, but we get a similar situation in the coastal zone because the sea level is rising, and with it you get increased king tides, you get increased inundation, you get increased coastal erosion. So speaking of adaptation, the Queensland government has recently remapped what they call the coastal hazard zone for the entire Queensland coast, many thousands of kilometres, based upon what the sea level is projected to be in the year 2100. So they're trying to take a precautionary approach, and they've mapped this all out at a scale, where spatial planners in local governments can see it. And, so that's information. So that's useful information for planning and for development. So if you're looking to put some expensive new building or infrastructure in that zone, you need to think, well, at some point in the future, that's going to be at much greater risk from these coastal hazards. So, you know, that's information people need to be thinking about.
I think the other thing is too, with the governments, they seem to be very slow, or either that or they don't learn from history. Brisbane in particular, it's had a history. If you go back to 1841, there was massive flooding. There was an actual cyclone hit in 1893, and severe and higher river levels than the last year. Then you had the 74 floods, and there was a Royal Commission or Commission of Inquiry, and they recommended obviously the creation or the building of the Wivenhoe dams for a bit of flood mitigation and storage. But that proposal also said build 2 more actual flood mitigation dams, one further down the Brisbane River and one on the Bremer. Well, Uncle Joe, he did the Wivenhoe Dam, but by the time he'd gone, the Wivenhoe Dam, I think came around about 84 that actually finished. The other land and that was put aside, but those other 2 flood mitigation dams were never put in place. And then, of course, we've had the 2011 floods, and of course the ones recently. So it's somewhat disturbing that the governments don't sort of learn fast enough. We've got to be hit several times before we're actually prompted to do enough. Do you think this is a real problem in regards to making the powers that be commit to fixing these problems and spend? Of course, there's a lot of money to spend, and to spend the money that's necessary.
Yeah, you know, I have some sympathy for them. It's a difficult decision. So, I mean, dams. See, the interesting thing about dams is, like, that dam is meant to serve 2 purposes. It's, on one hand, it's meant to store water to provide water security during drought, right? And the droughts are getting worse. And at the same time, it's meant to be able to hold, you know, help prevent flooding by storing floodwater. Well, they're 2 opposing objectives. You can't manage a dam to do both of them at the same time. If you want to have it for drought, it's got to be full of water. If you want to have it to mitigate against flood risk, it's got to be empty of water, right? So, and the other problem with dams is they have a fixed life. They silt up and they're expensive to maintain. And so whenever you build a dam, that immediately allows developers to develop property below the dam, right? And if you increase the dam wall, then you create more land, you know, more land for development. So, you know, this is another big issue with dams. It's not the holy grail of solving our problems. With everything, there are trade-offs. But this, you know, I think this concept of managed retreat it's up until now, we really haven't thought of that as a viable adaptation strategy, because it's just too severe. But we're starting to see, as these climate impacts rise, what we're hitting the limits of adaptation based upon how we currently do things. And we might have to have some more major adaptations, such as a managed retreat.
But that becomes fairly difficult when a government's got a policy, and it doesn't matter which party is, for more immigration. You know, I mean, admittedly, COVID's knocked it back a little bit, but under the general scheme, we're running somewhere between 200,000 new migrants a year. That puts a lot of pressure on existing infrastructure and where people can live in that. So, and the problem is they seem to pile into these areas that already got these problems. So it's got to be even more difficult to sort of get a retreat if you're allowing people to drop into these areas.
Yeah, no, it's a tough problem for sure. But you know, there are some sectors which are more adaptable than others, and actually agriculture is one of them. and I'm thinking more of crops here than livestock. Livestock's got other issues. Livestock's very exposed to heat waves and droughts, obviously, right? So that's the big climate risk for livestock, is increase in the frequency, intensity and duration of droughts and heat waves. But, you know, when it comes to crops, there's a lot of what we call adaptive capacity. There's a lot you can do. You can change the varieties you grow. You can change how you farm it. You know, you can change tilling practices, etc. So whilst obviously crops are very climate sensitive, the agricultural sector is highly adaptive. There's a lot of adaptive capacity there.
Well, agriculture has done fairly well in the 30 years or so since James Hansen's first appearance before Congress.
And that's because it's got kind of built into it it has to be adaptive. I mean, for a start, they're continually breeding new varieties, you know, because of pests, right? And disease. They kind of have to do that anyway. And they're always trying to improve crops. And because it's a completely managed system, you know, it has a lot of adaptive capacity. So like, you know, in the Murray-Darling Basin, in the southern part of it, there's been about a 15 to 20% decline in winter rainfall, but they have improved, believe it or not, their water use efficiency. They're using less, they're growing more crops with less water because they're being less wasteful with the water, and that's compensated for the climate change effect. So yeah, agriculture has a lot of adaptive capacity that we need to recognise.
Yeah, it's definitely shown that resilience through technology advancements, and as you say, the genetics and things like that. We've actually improved the harvests overall over the last few decades, where there was a lot before. There was a lot of fear in regards to yields would go to drops dramatically and cause problems with ability to feed the world, but we've basically done a good job.
There will still be major impacts in certain regions because, you know, as I said, the Murray-Darling Basin's in trouble, right? It's just seeing this. It's had 15 to 20% decline in winter rainfall, and that's continuing. And so, you know, there are real limits to what you can do in terms of water use efficiency.
I suppose the other thing is,
and the main growing season is winter. It's a winter growing season. So cropping down there that's rain fed is in trouble, kind of, if you think about it kind of strategically. But yeah, it depends where you are in Australia and what you're growing and how you're growing it.
But usually the other thing that is with rain, it goes around and comes around to a degree. But there's got to be periods where it's got to be prolonged before you get that next lot of relief. But maybe we can just move on to the fire risk and things like that, because it was interesting in the 2019-25 season, there was a number of inquiries. The federal government had a inquiry, the New South Wales government, and also the Victorian government. And there was a lot of submissions by a lot of different organisations and individuals in regards to their view of the fires and what happened and what needs to be done. But one of the reoccurring points in so many papers was calling out climate change. And even I think there was a paper a submission by the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, which is a group of high-level emergency service in the fire service and that of not only New South Wales but Victoria, and also past and present leaders in that field. And the opening sort of stanzas in the first chapter was, we got to do something about climate change. But I would have thought, we already know there's going to be an impact for climate change. Surely the emphasis has to be on the management of our assets, and that's their job. Well, you know, prescribed burning, reducing fuel, barriers between the bush and the townships and things like that. Isn't that now the management of those sort of things as important as discussing, well, this is climate change is going to be an impact. Well, what the hell are we going to do about it? You know, isn't that the really driving force that should be these leadership groups should be ensuring that they know the fires are going to get bigger and sort of more intense and more frequent. Well, what's your plan for sort of mitigating the impact on the wildlife, the forest, and also communities?
Yeah, well, that's precisely what that group were trying to bring to the federal government's attention. They were pointing out that climate change has made and is making the fire weather conditions worse, which means we're going to get far, far more intense and more extensive. We're going to have a longer fire season. We're going to get landscapes burning that we're not used to burning, and we're going to get very, very severe fires. So what they were calling for was for the government to recognise that, and therefore to invest more resources and more capacity in preparing for these fires and in managing when they occur, and then for post-fire recovery. So they were actually calling, the reason why they were pointing to climate change was we just can't, we have to have a dramatic increase in the level of resources and capacity we put into it. So what
I
needs to be
understand.
done? So what needs to be done is, and this is really the critical point, when you have, and this is the relationship between the fire weather conditions I was talking about, how dry it is, how hot it is, how windy it is, and the actual extent and severity of the bushfire when it occurs. Because you would have heard of this index, it's called the Forest Fire Danger Index, the fire danger warnings, that semicircular thing. It goes from low, moderate, high, very high, extreme, catastrophic. It goes to catastrophic now. That's based upon a scientific index called the Forest Fire Danger Index that was calibrated in the 1970s against the hottest, most severe fires of the time. And up until the 1990s, it went low, medium, very high, extreme. But, in the late 1990s and 2000s, they started to get values of the Forest Fire Danger Index. It was scaled between 0 and 100, with 0 being extreme. Values way over 100. In the 2019 25s, we were getting values of like 170 in some places, and the fires are more severe, more intense, because the temperatures are more intense, because the fire weather conditions are worse. Now, when you have these extreme, and so they came up with a new category called catastrophic, which means it's too late. Once the Forest Fire Danger Index is above the middle, above 50, you basically can't, the amount of fuel becomes irrelevant. It's actually driven by the dryness of the fuel, and the dryness of the fuel is a function of the weather and climate. So one of the other things that, and the Royal Commissions all recognise this, climate change is making the fire weather conditions worse. When you have dangerous fire weather conditions, you can't actually do any fuel reduction burning. It's too dangerous. The fires get away. So the number of days a year where you can do that fuel reduction burning is getting less and less. So where does that leave us? And this is what they recommended, those experts. We need a greater capacity to put out bushfires when they start. And yes, we need to do more fuel reduction burning, but it needs to be targeted. It needs to be targeted to be very close to our built assets, to our buildings and infrastructure. And we also need to be thinking about, this is where this planned retreat comes in as well, or spatial planning. Like, we need to be thinking about where we're building homes and building infrastructure so that it's not exposed to bushland. So it's that urban, peri-urban bushland interface. We've got to be planning a lot more carefully. So the firefighters need more resources. We need, they recommended having a national fleet of water bomber planes and helicopters, right? That's maintained in Australia. At the moment, we rent them from Canada. They're flown out from Canada during the Canadian off season. The problem is, because of climate change, our fire season's getting longer, the Canadian fire season's getting longer, and they're overlapping, and they're not able to send all the planes out here, or helicopters there, of course we need them there. So, we probably do need a national fleet of firefighting planes. We need to be resourcing our emergency services much more. And we need to be thinking much more about how we're managing the fire risk around our building, our build assets, and a lot more about spatial planning. So
I suppose the thing is, prevention is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I read the same report, and my opinion was, to a fair degree, yes, they had some valid points, but their focus was on empire building. And New South Wales now has added a new bureaucracy called the Office of Resilience, staffed by one of those people who was part of that report and organisation. So now you've got the emergency service, you've got the Country Fire Authority, and now you've got this resilience, Office of Resilience, another multi-billion-dollar bureaucracy that's asking for, we want more planes, we want more equipment, whatever. And yet the same people knock back the prescribed burning to less than 2%, when the figures are always suggested 6 to 8% is required to protect the forest. And the thing is, if they don't do something, well, you might protect houses and lives.
No, I need to jump in there, because this is a big climate change story. That was true in 1960, was true in 1970, and it's become less true in every decade. Because, as I said, under dangerous fire conditions, you cannot fuel reduction burn. And during a bushfire that's driven by dangerous fire weather conditions, the amount of fuel is irrelevant, right? It's to do with the dryness of the fuel. So as climate change makes fire weather conditions worse, broad scale fuel reduction burning becomes less and less effective. The science is very clear that what remains effective is reducing the fuel within about 40 or 50 metres of the building. That makes a big difference. But under dangerous fire weather conditions, doing it over a broad landscape level doesn't have any effect. So again, this is just one of the messages of climate change, is we also have to adapt how we're managing these fire risks. Many things, we can manage these risks, but we have to change what we're doing to take into account what the science is now telling us.
I think the other thing is, but we're condemning a lot of actual forests where there's no people to just continue mega fires as we go through, and we're not going to do anything about it. So, well, I disagree
because under dangerous fire weather conditions, the forest is going to burn irrespective of how you manage it. I mean, that's what the science is telling us. So we're in a new fire regime now, right? It's not what it was 50 years ago. So we've got to change we do have to change our understanding here of what will be effective under these conditions.
So basically you're saying, well, there's 70% of our forest areas we can't do anything about. They're just going to be obliterated every 5 to 10 years, and that's just the end of it.
Well, you've got to keep in mind that all our native eucalypt forests are fire adapted, right? They're all, other than the ash forests in Victoria, they're all sprouters. They're all adapted to fire. So it's different to rainforest. Rainforest is a different issue, but you can't fuel reduction burn in rainforest because it's too wet anyway. So again, rainforest drought burn when you have severe drought. And drought, these terribly drying conditions, which produce extreme fire weather conditions. I'm just pointing out that climate change also, it's changed our fire regime, and we have to rethink, our whole land and forest management strategies. What we did in the 1960s or 70s isn't working and won't work going forward.
In just moving off the natural disaster type things and that,
Yep.
and back to sort of allocations of things like the carbon budgets, is that some of the areas that you look at?
Not in Working Group 2. That's what Working Group 1 and 3 look at.
So it skips you.
Working Group 1 looks at, how much more carbon can we burn? Well, if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I'll just point out that that's just, people say to me, 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like much. Think of it as a Earth thermometer reading. So like the human body, a healthy temperature is like 36.7 degrees. 38 degrees means you've got a fever, and 40 degrees is life-threatening. Well, that's what we mean when we talk about these degrees of global warming. If we want to limit the amount of global warming is compared to the pre-industrial average, is a function of how much greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere. It's called the carbon budget. So how much more carbon can we burn to get to 1.5 degrees, how much to get to 2 degrees, etc. That's called the carbon budget. Working Group 1 calculates all of them. In terms of what we can do, how do we mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions? That's what Working Group 3 does.
And that's what we can look forward to next week. But before you go, probably two things I'd probably like to touch on is sea level rises and some of the confusions in regards to, we all learn basic exercise, and you put a bucket of water into a bathtub and it all rises to the same level. So you think all the melts and that, you would get a sort of even measurement all over the globe, allowing for tides and all those sort of different things. But what are some of the factors that come into the play in regards to some areas have a high trend or a high rate of sea level increase versus others is sort of not so severe? So what are some factors? Is that I have read in parts, some part of it is where the system isn't, where the sea level isn't rising so much, is because the rebound in the earth, because of now we're in an interglacial, the ice has moved away and some of the land masses are rebounding, and then other areas are naturally subsiding because of the type of materials that make up the land mass.
Yeah. So to begin with, the surface of the 75% of the world's ocean, and it's not flat, right? So when you heat water, it expands. Okay, so for a start, we've got big differences in surface temperatures, ocean temperatures all around the world, from the pole to the equator. Plus, you've got ocean currents. Plus, you've got wind. So all of those combine, and the Earth twirling around, to create a lot of variation in the sea level against some benchmark. Now, the fact is we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of instruments all around the oceans. We've got tidal gauges everywhere. We've got instruments in the ocean. We've got satellites. So I've got incredibly accurate records of how the ocean is changing seasonally from year to year, and what the long-term trends are. But and this is the other kind of interesting fact: the greenhouse gases we're putting up the atmosphere keep a lot of the heat energy within the atmosphere. 90% of that extra heat, 10% of that extra heat goes to heat the land, 90% of it goes to heat the ocean, right? So most of the extra heat's heating the ocean, and as you heat water, it expands. And also, when you melt ice on land and it goes into the ocean, it adds. So the sea level rise is slowly, very slowly, overall rising. Now, that sea level rise is evident in tidal gauges everywhere. And what it means is, if you think of it, the base level is rising, well, all these other coastal processes get higher. King tides get higher, storm surges get higher, etc. Now, whether you see that happening or not at a particular stretch of coast depends upon what's happening at the coastline. It depends upon the coastal geomorphology. Do you have a sandstone cliff? Do you have a very muddy estuary? Do you have sand dunes? And it also depends upon, you know, the coastal infrastructure and settlement. So the Gold Coast is an interesting case in point. It's built along, it's a big city now, it's 650,000 people. It's built along about 34 kilometres of coastline, and it's all beach. But it's probably the most heavily engineered part of the coastline in Australia. The beach is kept artificially wide by beach enrichment. And there's been these massive, all the wetlands have all been turned into these canal suburban estates. So if you look at the data in the sea level rise, in the tidal gauges, the sea level is there, but we're not seeing the impact of it because you're dealing with such a massively engineered coastline at Marsden. If you go up to Torres Strait, you have it's a very shallow sea to begin with, maybe only 40 metres or so, a lot of low-lying areas, and the sea level impacts there are more evident, and that it's causing, there's not the coastal engineering to mask the sea level rise, and there's more evidence of coastal erosion. So that's kind of the reason why, you know, it's a complicated story, sea level rise and what's happening in the coast.
It seems to vary from, you know, you got the Maldives and then their issues sort of thing, and then you've got the Pacific Islands. So, and they emphasise the impact. And in Australia, I suppose there is some worry in regards to the sea level rises on us. I mean, Cairns, well, the CBD of Cairns, it's lucky if it's 2 metres above sea level. And between a king tide and a storm surge, we aren't in a very good position sort of thing, but it's not stopping us from developing going forward. And sometimes you just wonder, are they making good risk assessments going forward?
Well, as I said, the Queensland government has completed this coastal risk assessment, projecting, you know, where risk could be in 80 years' time. But I think it's up to local, you know, it's still local governments which control the development that goes on. So I think that's where the problem perhaps lies.
Well, somewhere along the line, there's got to be a combination of the homeowner or property owner bearing the problem, but then the cost component is going to be put onto the ratepayers for any recompense or court action. So it's something that sort of maybe requires a little bit more attention in regards to not just the impact of the climate, but the impact on the hip pocket through court actions in the future on the ratepayers and taxpayers.
Absolutely. And we've got there's, you know, a really good example of that in New South Wales. You might have seen that situation in Coleroy Beach in New South Wales. Let me share my screen. It's worth, if you haven't come across it. So there's a whole series of houses which were collapsing into the sea from coastal erosion, and I'm just trying to find the best picture for you. And you can see what's going on there. This is massive scale. There's a 13-metre high concrete seawall being built to protect these houses from the coastal erosion that's been happening, because the front of these houses have been falling into the ocean. Now, the problem is, as soon as you build a concrete seawall, there's nowhere for the wave energy to go, and it bounces back and eats away the beach. So the surest way to get rid of the beach is to build a giant solid concrete seawall, because you're going to erode all your beach. And then eventually it erodes under the wall and the wall collapses. Now that wall is being 50% of it's being paid for by the homeowners and 50% by all the other ratepayers. So all the other ratepayers are protecting their property and getting and paying for their beach to be eroded away. So it's a very
I think we had the same situation down near Bunbury. I think they put out, they wanted to protect the shoreline a bit, and they worked it, and also the harbour thing, or the marina type area.
Yeah.
But what happened as soon as they put the grind out, it just swept away all the beach and kept eroding to the north of the groin. So, but you would think they would have understood that before they did it, not sort of, well, gee, we put this thing in, and now we've got this massive problem where we have to bring in hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of sand every year to sort of reinforce the beach.
That's right. Same thing happens at the Gold Coast. The reason why they do this beach enrichment at the Gold Coast is because New South Wales built all these groins all the way up and down North Coast, New South Wales. So naturally what happens is the East Australian current, it's a big like a giant sand circulator. The East Australian current brings sand down, and then it moves all the way up the East Coast, and then it gets carted down again. It's a giant circular action. So New South Wales builds all these structures on their beaches to stop their sand going, but then it stops the sand shifting up. So Gold Coast has no sand, so they're going to enrich their sand. So we create these problems. We're just creating problems for someone.
Okay, we've gone over the hour well and truly. Is there anything you want to touch on important in regards to impacts on, well, maybe the barrier reef or anything in particular before we wind up?
Well, I guess that's something we haven't talked about. And of course, the Great Barrier Reef is in the news a lot for these big coral bleaching events. And maybe I could just explain the connection to climate change there very quickly. So in the same way we get heat waves on land, you get heat waves over the ocean, and the surface water heats up. Now, when that temperature gets to a certain threshold, the coral, the hard coral, the coral actually has these microalgae living in it. The microalgae photosynthesize and feed the coral. They also give the coral its color. That's why it's so beautiful. Now, when you have these marine heat waves, the coral, the algae gets expunged from the coral, and the coral dies because it has no food, and it loses all its color because the microalgae have gone. Now the coral regrows, but it's a very slow process, and it takes about 10 years for the fastest growing coral to regrow. So if the same location gets hit by a marine heat wave 2 or 3 times within 10 years, it's basically finished. So the big problem for the Great Barrier Reef is we're seeing, and this gets back to what I said about an increase in the frequency and severity and duration of extreme weather events. That's true for these marine heat waves. So we're seeing an increase. The Great Barrier Reef has experienced 3 major heat waves, which have caused mass coral bleaching events over different parts of the Great Coral Reef. So it's of great concern because if global warming continues, we're going to see an increase in the frequency of these marine heat waves, increase in the frequency of coral bleaching events, and the coral won't have time to recover. So this is, a very serious issue for all tropical coral reef, but in particular the Great Barrier Reef.
Being up here, I think we in general and the tourist industry are basically sick and tired of people telling us or telling the world that the Great Barrier Reef is dead or dying and that. And it's still, it's not helpful in regards to some of the rhetoric, because regardless of what people keep saying, and we've got people like, I think Professor Hughes is one of the main characters up here who does some of the surveys. But we know every day, basically, the tourist operators go out to Agincourt Reef and a number of other shallow reefs, and the coral's still there. They're still taking visitors there. Now, yes, some reefs in the shallow areas, they do suffer from coral bleaching, but then you have events like in 2020 when United States, one of the institutes, scientific institutes, came out here, and I think it was Professor Beedman was on board with manned vehicle, and they came across a new reef that hadn't been documented before. And so it really, in finding that, there would have to be, because it's the first time it's been seen, they have to basically document as pristine. And it was a fairly, I mean, there's videos all over YouTube of it, and it's quite an impressive piece of reef. It's I think it's from the seafloor, it rises some 500 metres up to almost 2 metres from the surface. So that was an interesting discovery. Other reefs, I think it's the John Brewster Reef, I think was sort of given a bad rap by one of the recent reports saying the coverage was down to 21% on previous records. But people go out there and they dive on it, and they can actually show that that's not completely accurate. So do we need some other or more close attention on individual reefs, or is this whole or inclusive just saying the Great Barrier Reef is good enough, saying it's all dying?
It's a very good point, but the fact is there have been massive areas of mass coral bleaching, but as you say, that doesn't mean there aren't still plenty of good areas of reefs to take tourists to. So you're right, there needs to be much clearer messaging about the state of play. But the fact of the matter is that, again, the situation is worsening because of climate change. But no, I agree with you. The messaging needs to be much more nuanced here and more helpful. So I would agree with you there.
Yeah, I think that's the thing.
But the fact is, the data's there. It's pretty clear. There's been four very extensive mass bleaching events in 3 parts of the whole reef since 2017, and that's very well documented. So it's a fact. I mean, we can't pretend that doesn't exist. But
the other thing is, but
that doesn't mean there isn't good reef.
I think that's the problem. Is some of the messaging is too dramatic and sort of gets people up here worked at that the message is going out by certain people who carry a bit of weight, basically damaging our reputation and our tourist industry. So, like you say, the message has to be a little bit better. And overall, I think the AIMS recent report basically said the coral cover for the entire Great Barrier Reef is near its maximum, previous recorded maximum. So it's an evolving situation all the time. Things change, some things get bad, but then there's also a resilience in nature that sort of, well, maybe we shouldn't completely give up hope in going forward.
Sure, but as I said, there are limits to adaptation, and there's limits to natural adaptation as well that we can't deny.
Okay, thanks very much for your time tonight.
Yes.
Obviously, the conversation is going to continue next week with Professor Peter Newman on Working Group 3, and we'll talk about the carbon budgets and gigatons of CO2 and all those sort of things that adds into the problem. And that will lead on to the final in the episode, with David Caroli and have the conversation on climate change in general rather than the actual process. Yeah. So Brenden, look, thank you very much for your time tonight. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and and also maybe in a few months' time we'll come back and have an overview of where things have moved to as we move from into our winter and forward into the next summer, and how well we're going to be prepared.
Very, very, very happy to talk some more. Yeah.
Thanks very much. If you just hold on the line there, I'll just wrap the show up and introduce next week's show. If you have enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, as you heard, I will be speaking to Professor Peter Newman, author and presenter for Working Group 3. Peter comes from the Curtin University in West Australia, and he'll be talking in particular on the carbon budgets and their allocation moving forward to and mitigating. So please join me then.